Hey everyone, here are my thoughts on the new role-playing game come out by the Dungeon Coach, DC20 RPG. And we're going to get right into it with the playlist rules review. I've had a look through, I've read a lot of it. I haven't read the class stuff at the end, so I don't really know too much about the classes, but that's not really what I'm looking at. I'm kind of more looking at the core rules systems and how the game looks from an outside. I have watched a lot of videos from the Dungeon Coach recently because I saw this coming out, and I have listened to how he's explained the systems. They seem, pretty good on the surface, but I did dig a little deeper for some of these things, and we will check those out right now together. Let me just quickly TLDR run through my thoughts. Attacks and spells using a prime attribute or a attribute maximum just means that it's basically homogenized, so you know better or worse than anybody than anything else, because you could have a fighter that uses charisma to attack, and you could have a barbarian that uses might to attack, and they both have the same attack modifier when they attack with a weapon. So kind of just feels a bit silly. I mean, I understand why, but it still kind of makes sense in a game flavor, I guess, but it's still a bit weird. Mastery system feels too complicated to read and look at. Everything is something with mastery, and the mastery word doesn't always need to be there. You could just have it called something in the mastery system and then leave it at that. I think the initiative system is dope. I think that's really cool. I really like the idea of skill check style mini combats, and then the back and forth initiative. I think that's really, really cool. I think the death's door system is really cool. I like the idea of being at 0 hit points but still being able to do something rather than nothing. I think having attacks, both martial and spell attacks, as a d20 roll is really cool, except it relies on 2 different defenses, so you can't really implement that too much into 5e, but that's just how 5e spells works. There's not much I can do about that. I think it still feels better to roll dice to do damage, but I understand why it doesn't work in this system, because HP is a lot lower, and there's not a lot you can really do about that, because that's just how the system's designed. There's points, right? So there's action points, there's mana points, there's stamina points, there's grip points, there's rest points, there's lots of points. Lots of point systems, probably easy to track with an interactive character sheet. In my head, feels too complicated. Next, skill-based actions in combat look really cool. I love the idea. I saw, especially the falling, jumping one, jumping off like a fucking cliff with a great attack, with great axe, trying to slice someone in half from a cliff, and they take bludgeoning damage as well. I think that's amazing. That sounds really cool. Spell duels, being able to counter anybody by any other spellcaster, counting any other spellcaster. I think that's dope. Uses resources, of course, but I think it's really sick. I think there's lots of cool maneuvers that you can use, and I think it's really, really interesting, but I think it feels a little bit like ability bloat in a video game where you've got all these buttons, you don't really know what they all do all the time, and they're there, and you have to have them on there because you might want to use them, but you're not sure what they do all the time, so it's a little bit annoying and a little bit intimidating to look at, but once you get used to it, I'm sure it's fine. I think mana points for spells is cool. There are a lot of rules for things to spend action points on that aren't tied to classes, which I think is good and bad. I think it's good because of options. Having options is always awesome, but I think it's bad because it's a bit of info overload. You're not going to need all those abilities. I think all weapons having passives is a really cool idea. It gives themes to all the different types of weapons, and I think that is a huge thing that the fighter in 5e is lacking, is flavor for which weapon they're using. And extra things for which weapon they're using. It's just like, take a longsword because it does the most damage and it's the easiest to wield, or take a rapier if you want to be dex based because it does the most damage. Take a great axe or a great sword if you've got brutal critical somehow, or you do great sword because it just does more damage on average, right? So those are the things you do. You don't really take anything else unless you're doing it for flavor, which the flavor could be added depending on the weapon type. It could add a bleed, it could add something else, so that's really cool. I think that having these passives on weapons lessens the blow that you aren't rolling damage dice. Combo spellcasting looks insane. It looks really cool. It's like 2 spellcasters could team up and cast like the craziest spell you've ever seen, which I think is really dope. I think combat time being doubled to 12 seconds a round instead of 6, and then having 1 minute be 5 rounds of combat instead of 10. I really like that a lot. I think that actually would be something you could quite easily implement into 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. It would make combats more dynamic because you have to think about the fact that your spell isn't going to last literally the whole combat. It's going to last maybe until it's just about dead, but you're not quite sure, so you might have to save a spell slot. I think condition stacking is unnecessary and complicated. I think some of the conditions that stack on top of each other, I think it's not really necessary. I think it's enough of a hindrance already to just be one condition as it is, with the exclusion of exhaustion. And I really like the way they handle exhaustion in DC20, where it's -1 at level 1, -2 at level 2, -3 at level 3, and just so on and so forth, and it doesn't actually stop you from, it doesn't actually just like outright kill you at some point. I think the ancestry system looks really cool, being able to pick abilities. Ooh, I'm a half elf, half orc, and then just pick traits from the elf, traits from the orc, and then just pick whichever ones you want. I think it's really cool. So I have the PDF open that you can go and download from the Kickstarter page. I'll put a link down below because I think it is worth it. I think it's pretty cool. So check that out. He's not sponsoring this video or anything. I just really enjoyed the read and the ideology behind creating a TTRPG that's basically mixing Pathfinder and D&D 5e sort of together, but adding a lot of homebrew rules that he's obviously come up with to fix some situations he's had in 5e or Pathfinder games before. So here we have the playtest rules preview. Like I said, you can go and download this from the Kickstarter website, and you'll have all the same information that I do. So it's kind of a introductory to how the game plays. From videos, basically, I have learnt that attacks and spellcasting, you're always rolling a d20. So no matter what you do, you're rolling a d20, which I think is pretty cool. I actually kind of agree with the fact that spells should roll d20s and not force saving throws all the time. Like, sometimes, yeah, for certain effects the spell might have, but I really think it's cool to have spellcasters rolling d20s a lot more as well. However, no matter how you flavor your stats of your spellcaster or your melee fighter, your martial fighter, they all use what is known as a prime attribute for rolling your attacks and stuff, which just means that you're no better or worse at anything than anybody else. So it kind of homogenizes attack rolls into everyone being the same. So like, why even have an attribute to add? Why not just set DCs lower and just roll a straight d20? Anyway, that was a little bit of my concern with it. There is might, agility, charisma, and intelligence. I think it's pretty cool. I think having 4 stats is fine. And I think the idea of having a stat array that is just plus numbers and not some arbitrary big number that then you have to figure out a stat, like a bonus number that you then use to add on to everything, is fine too. I think that's fine too. I think the skills list looks fine. I think it's great. I think the attribute limit idea for your stats is great. It's basically like proficiency bonus. There's like a level cap that gives you an ability modifier cap as well. Here we go. Here's the section that I want to talk about a little bit. It is called the mastery system. It feels complicated to read and look at, and everything is something with the word mastery next to it. It doesn't always need the word mastery next to it. It's like skill mastery, just call it skills. Trade mastery, just call them trades. Language mastery, just call it languages. Like, the word mastery comes up too much and it's kind of a little bit confusing in a sense, for me anyway, as I was reading through this. I don't have any form of dyslexia that I'm aware of, or comprehension issues that I am aware of, but the word mastery comes up a lot. I know the whole system is like a subset of mastery systems, but like, if you've got it under the mastery title, they don't all need to have mastery in there, and it was kind of like worded just lengthily to try and make it clearer, but it wasn't. So, the way D&D deals with, leveling up your skills is it's basically based off your proficiency bonus, and then it's based off of your stat bonus, right? I think that is easy to understand, and the way that the Dungeon Coach explains that this isn't very good is that you just arbitrarily get better at stuff as you level up without actually having to train or without possibly wanting to be better at those skills. And the way he gets around this is by putting points into skills, and you get skill mastery, so you get extra bonuses, which is kind of how it works in Pathfinder. However, having played a little Pathfinder, it is more complicated than it needs to be. I think 5e does it really well. I think it's just simple. It's you're trained, and that's it. And every time you level up or you gain stats, it goes up, and that's it, and you don't need to think about it. There are other things like expertise that you get in 5e, which is basically like adding a notch from one of these skill masteries, but that's very limited and it doesn't happen very often, so it's a little bit easier to comprehend when you only have to do it every now and then, whereas this seems you do it quite frequently. You have to put different points into different things. Like skill points go into skills, and then masters, and then trade points go into trades, and then language points go into languages, and it's like, why can't they all just be the same point system and you just put one in whatever thing you want? Next section is checks and saves. Pretty clear cut. I think it all makes a lot of sense. He has stacking advantage and disadvantage in this game, which I don't like because it's easy to lose track of how many advantages you've gained and how many disadvantages you gain and blah blah blah. I think just having, you either have disadvantage or you have advantage, or they just all cancel each other out. I think that's better, and I think 5e does it just fine. I don't agree with the stacking advantage and disadvantage thing. I think it's better without it because it's less complicated that way. I like the idea of multiple check penalties. I think that's a cool idea, but you don't need it so much in 5th edition, because 5th edition you only really ever have 2 attacks because you have an action that gives you 2 attacks. The reason this is really good for this system is the action point system that exists, which is you have 4 action points and you can use them as reactions or off or on your turn for multiple different things. And this essentially allows you to like attack, which is kind of Pathfinder does something similar where you can make like full attack. I think that multiple check penalty thing for doing the same thing more than once on a turn, I think it's pretty good. I think it's a pretty good idea. Degrees of success and failure, I really like this. I really, really, really like this. I think having a success where it's just, you know, you beat the DC, having it beaten by 5, beaten by 10, beaten by more, each success that you gain gives you some kind of other benefit. I think that's great. It works really well in this system, again, because weapons don't deal weapon damage. They deal flat damage depending on the weapon type. The more success you have over that AC of your opponent, the more damage you deal, as well as, depending on your class and other abilities and stuff, you stack damage on top of that as well. But I think that's really cool. I think not rolling damage is something that you just have to get used to. I don't think it's that bad, but it also might feel kind of bad to start with. There are 2 different kinds of armor class. They're called defenses in this game, which I think kind of is okay too. Just renaming it to defenses. So there's 2 different kinds of defenses. There's physical defense and mystical defense. I think that's cool. I also think it's really good that your mystical defense is typically going to be much higher as a spellcaster because you have intelligence and charisma added to the base, rather than just another arbitrary thing attached to it. So I think that's pretty cool. They have damage reduction. The reason they have damage reduction is because the HP pool of characters is not as high as it is in 5th edition. So makes sense. You want to reduce damage because you just don't have as much HP in general. There's a lot of reasons for that, and it's mostly because you don't roll for weapon damage. So damage is calculated more evenly, I suppose. There's not such a huge swing in the amount of damage that can be done. The death's door mechanic, I think, and the way exhaustion works in this game too, I think is actually really cool. So when you hit 0 hit points, you get a level of exhaustion. Exhaustion in this game works as exhaustion level 1 is -1 to everything you do. Exhaustion level 2 is -2 to everything you do. 3, 4, 5, and so on is just minus that number to everything you do, which I think that's fine. It's not a humongous crutch where suddenly your speed goes to 0 and all this other stuff. It's like, no, you just get terrible at doing everything, which I think is fine. Death's Door also puts you at an action point limit. So I mentioned this before, but you usually have 4 action points on your turn or in one round of combat, and it limits you to 1. So you can do one thing, right? So you can either spend that to like heal yourself, or you can spend it to move, or you can spend it to do an attack as a last ditch effort, or you can spend it to cast a spell. Maybe a lot of spells seem to cost 2 action points, but cantrips and stuff cost 1. And then you can't concentrate on anything, so spells are a little bit out of the window in terms of that. But then the death saves at the end of each of your turns are a little bit different to 5e. It's not you make a certain number of them or you fail a certain number of them and then you straight out die, whatever. This one is you make a death save, which is same as always, and if you fail, you take 1 damage. So what happens is if you take minus a certain threshold in damage, calculated by your character's level and a few other things, but if you take minus a certain amount of damage, like negative damage from 0, that's when you end up dying. So healing in the game matters a lot because you don't want to be at low health, because the lower health you are, the higher chance there is that even if you're above 0, something could hit you enough and hard enough to put you into the negative threshold that would kill you in one hit, and it could happen, which I think is fine. I think that's a fine mechanic. But essentially the idea is, instead of hitting 0 hit points and going unconscious, you hit 0 hit points and now you can only really do one thing around. You're super limited, but you're not dead and you're not completely useless, right? Which I think is a big thing, because I think in 5e, once you hit 0 hit points and you go down, it's like it's snowball effect where you just start losing even more, which I think kind of sucks. Damage, so this is degrees of damage. Again, I kind of talked about this previously a little bit, where it's like the higher success chance you have, the more damage you end up dealing. Okay, combat resources. This is the big thing in this game, is action points and mana points, and there's stamina points and grit points. There's a lot of points. There's lots of different points, and I think the points thing is like, maybe there's too many different kinds of points. Maybe there's too many point systems. There's rest points as well. I don't know. It feels like maybe there's too many points. But I'll explain them very briefly. Action points, I mentioned it before, you get 4 action points. You can use these to do a multitude of different things on your turn. Then mana points are basically like spell slots, essentially. But instead of them being limited to levels, they're just generalized. Cast a spell. And when you cast that spell, it costs action points to cast. So probably 2 for a decent spell. Think first level or higher. And then you also spend your mana points. Some of them require you to spend mana points, others don't, and others allow you to spend more mana points to increase the spell's radius, range, damage, multitude of different things that you can choose from, right? Then martial characters have stamina points. Stamina points are basically like mana points for your melee abilities. So you attack, that's 1 action point, and then instead of spending another action point to add something to it, maybe your class has something you can do with a stamina point, so you spend stamina points on it instead. Mana points reset on a long rest, and stamina points reset on as soon as you finish combat, basically. As soon as you finish combat, they reset. So you've got all your stamina points back. So that's one way that martial characters have like that whole, they get everything back on a short rest kind of feel, that's basically how it works. You can't just pump as many mana points as you want into a spell. There's a limit based on your level and stuff like that. Then grit points are like based on your charisma, and it allows you to like basically reduce damage or like give you advantage on saves and stuff like that, which is kind of like, you know, you grit and bear it. Actions and reactions. So there's a minor action, which is basically your 5th edition free action, right? So you can use it on picking stuff up, drawing a weapon, sheathing a weapon, blah, blah, blah. One little thing you can do a turn for free, essentially. And then there are 4 action points, and there is like attack, disarm, grapple, shove, tackle. There's a few different things. Then you got defensive actions, which are, you know, same sort of thing, but you can disengage, dodge, hide. They work differently in this game, and you can spend more action points to do more things with them. But every character can do them, and they cost the same as every other character. Although, I'm sure some class features mean you can do different ways to do those actions. Then there is move, help. Help works differently. Help is not advantage on a roll. Help is you give them a d8. So it's basically like Bardic Inspiration, but if you do it more often, or if you have it from multiple people, it goes down from a d8, d6, d4, and drops down, right? Pretty easy. Skill-based actions. Yeah, so skill-based actions in combat looks pretty cool. Like there's a lot of different skills you can use in combat, which is I think is pretty cool. Spell duels, this whole being able to like cast a spell off your turn to reflect somebody else's spell and basically counter spell, I think it's really cool. You do have to use action points. You do have to use your own mana points to probably do something, but being able to do it no matter what, for anybody, I think is really cool. There are maneuvers, okay? There's a bunch of attack maneuvers. Power attack, sweeping attack, extended attack, expose, hamstring, like all these different things. There's all these different things you can do. This isn't limited to a class. This is just, everyone can do these things. There's grapple maneuvers, there's body block, there's takedown, slam, throw. There's defensive maneuvers like parry, protection, raise shield, sidestep, swap, taunt. There's weapon maneuvers for specific weapons like axes, bows, hammers, fists, crossbows, chains, picks. There's a bunch of different stuff that you can do that isn't based on your class or your race or anything. It's just based on what you're wielding and what you think you might want to do in combat. I think it's dope to have all these options. I do think it slows down learning the game, because there's so many things that you could possibly do that you literally have to have this page in the book open all the time so that you could remember that these are all the things that you can do, which some players will love, and I love it, but I can see why it's not for everybody, right? Combo spellcasting looks really, really cool. Now, there's a bit of a setup to it, as you'd imagine, right? You both have to know the same spell, for one. You have to be able to cast it, so you've got to have enough AP, and you've got to have enough mana points. You also have to decide the primary caster, and you also have to be going on the same turn. Like literally one person will have to delay their turn to match the other person, which you can do. You can easily delay your turn to match someone else's in this game. You can just say, I delay my initiative until this person's turn. The best thing about this combo spellcasting is you have a maximum MP limit that you can spend per person. not per spell. So you can add these two spells together and essentially double the effect of the spellcasting ability by both of you putting all like mana points into it. So pretty damn cool. Starting combat. The time in combat has been increased from 5th editions. Instead of 6 seconds per 1 round of combat, it is now 12 seconds, which means 1 minute is 5 rounds of combat instead of 10. I think this is great. I think this is actually amazing because casting a 1 minute spell usually would last like basically the whole combat in 5th edition. And so having it only last 5 rounds, which is kind of half combat, which is still a pretty decently long time. Like 5 rounds of combat is still pretty long, but I think that's actually really cool because there's a chance of those spells running out now, which is pretty interesting. I like it a lot. There are 2 different kind of types of combat encounters that I've seen. One of them is a group check style combat encounter. Basically use skill checks or weapon attacks or whatever to succeed a certain number of times to say that you defeated the encounter. And this could mean that like out of the 5 people, like 3 of them could fail horribly and 2 of them could succeed really, really well, and then you'd still be able to win the encounter essentially, right? But every time you fail something, those players take damage, right? And this order doesn't really matter because it's not like attack, deal damage, that thing's dead now, it can't hurt us. It's like everything's happening in a quick cinematic moment at the same time-ish. Then there's regular initiative, so everybody rolls initiative, but in here he's got like a different way of doing initiative, so you can, instead of just rolling your, whatever stat, you can pick what skill you want to choose you're leading your initiative into combat with. You could use an investigation check if you're looking at something. You could use an attack check like normal. You can use, any kind of check that you can justify in a sense. You can use that as your initiative roll, which they sort of do this in Pathfinder already, right? Pathfinder has different rolls for initiative, like you roll stealth initiative if you're trying to be sneaky, stuff like that. This initiative order system is actually really cool. You set a DC for the fight. DC might be 10. Players all roll their initiative like normal. If any one of the players beats the DC, player team gets to go first. If the player team wins, one of their players, whoever got the highest initiative, goes first. And then the enemy team gets to go. And then the player team goes again. And then the enemy team goes. And then the player team goes. And you go back and forth between player team, enemy team, player team, enemy team. I think that is amazing because it balances out combat in a sense where actions and action economy is being traded back and forth at a very steady rate. Now, you could group these up like he suggests later. Like you could do like player, player, enemy, enemy, whatever order you want to go in to try and balance it out depending on if you don't have an even number of players versus an even number of enemies, right? Now, if none of them make the success check against the encounter DC, because maybe it's a little bit more difficult or maybe everybody just rolled really, really horribly, which does happen, then enemies go first. Player, enemy, player. So it's basically just the opposite way around, right? Players are designated by what order they go in depending on their initiative roll, right? But you can delay your initiative, so you can just put your initiative wherever you want. So you can be like, I'm going first. Well, actually, I don't want to go first. I want to go like after this person. So you wait for that person's turn, and then you go next. Which enemy goes is entirely up to the DM. They can pick this one enemy because they want them to do a specific ability, so it buffs the rest of the bad guys. Or they want them to do this ability because they want to try and lock down the caster. Or they can do this ability because they want to just retaliate to the guy that hit them. Like there's lots of different options for the GM to then tactically figure out or logically figure out which enemy would attack next and then who they would attack. That's freaking cool. I think that's amazing. I think that's a really good thing that I want to steal and put into my own 5e games, and it doesn't seem like it would be very difficult to implement into 5th edition at all as a homebrew rule. Now, conditions. I disagree with this entirely. But, to each their own. There are stacking conditions. So I think that's stupid. I think exhaustion is about the only thing that should stack, and levels of exhaustion, because you get more and more and more and more exhausted if you don't actually rest at some point. Resting seems... I watched a video on him on the Dungeon Coach talking about resting and saying it was really simple. This seems really complicated now. There's a quick rest, there's a short rest, there's a full rest, there's a long rest, there's a half a long rest, there's rest points. Why is there so much? I know rests are like ridiculous because players try and take them all the time as soon as they've like, we walked for 5 minutes, we better have a rest. At least in the videos that I watched. The leveling system and at least the class leveling system was aimed for you to get your maximum class ability by level 10. And so from level 10 onwards, you could essentially multi-class, or you could gain talents in different things and take different abilities and do extra stuff and gain abilities from other subclasses and blah, blah, blah. And I thought that was really cool because a lot of games in D&D do only go from like level 1 to level 10. So I think that's a pretty cool idea. The ancestry system looks pretty cool. You pick from a list of traits that are from your race, essentially. You can kind of pick whatever you look like. You can make your own race and then just choose whatever you want from everywhere, essentially. And that is my thoughts on DC20. Big shout out to Dungeon Coach. I think this is an enormous step in the right direction for tabletop role-playing games. And I'm going to definitely be stealing a few of his ideas and trying to implement them as homebrew rules in my own 5th edition games. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm ready to step away from 5th edition just because of the amount of effort I've put into learning the system and also the amount of, I'm straight up going to say money that I've put into buying books and other things for it on virtual tabletops. Remember, you can follow everywhere at Critical Myths. You can jump on to my Patreon, become a free member. Lots of free stuff. It's all 5th edition supplement stuff. Every week there's something new out. I got maps, monsters, magic items. Go check all those things out. Links down below.